Okay, welcome everybody to today's session. I can see lots of people are joining us on Zoom, which is great to see. And you can also be joining us here in lots of other different places around the internet to watching this with us live. And you may well be watching this or listening to this in replay as well. So if you're with us now, then keep engaging, get involved. If you're taking this in after the event, then get involved on social media and let us know what you thought of it, because we won't be able to sadly answer your questions here and now live. But for everyone else that is watching us and joining us now, then we look forward to interacting with you as I'm joined today by the one and only James MacPherson. There he is with the best background I've seen so far on the Safety Roundtable.
I was waiting for you to point that out. It looks like I'm in my daughter's bedroom. I'm not. I'm actually in like a co-working space. But as I turned the camera on, I was like, this does look like a child's bedroom, unfortunately. But that was yeah, that's not where
I had just assumed it was your bedroom, James, to be honest. But perhaps
busted.
I got the wrong end of the stick. So we're going to be talking today about operational risk success, and the background to this is that James has produced. I'll tell you what. Let me stop sharing. James has produced this guide. Is guide the right word for it, James?
That's what we call it, a guidebook. Yeah.
A guidebook, which I've got my copy of. I know James has got his copy because he was just showing me. So we're just going to talk about this basically. Before we get into it, James, do you want to just give a quick bit of background onto yourself in case there are anybody that doesn't know who you are?
Yeah, sure. I always find this bit really socially awkward. But essentially, my name is James McPherson. I think I know I'm looking around at a few faces and names that I recognise. So nice to see some of you. Person. I'm primarily from a company called Fluent, but I also run a company called Risk Assessor, and then most people know me from rebrand and safety. So I'll run you through those really quickly. Rebrand and safety is pretty much where all of this stuff started. So I've been a safety professional for about just over a decade, I think now. I started rebrand and safety about 5-ish years ago, I think it was, which essentially was a podcast when it started. And it was probably my therapy more than anything, just for a lot of things in safety kind of frustrated me for a very long time. So I therapized myself through that podcast and to type to buy actual therapy. And then eventually it turned out quite a lot of people resonated with what we were talking about on there. And then that led to the consultancy business, which is Risk Fluent. So with Risk Fluent, we kind of pretty much do two types of work. We do what we call technical consulting, which is kind of like what most people see as normal health and safety, like technical health and safety, if that makes sense. And then we do transformational consultancy as well, which is like what we're talking about today, kind of operational risk, culture, and human performance, and all of that stuff. And then about I don't know, I think it was like May last year, maybe March last year, we took over Risk Assessor, which is an app for risk assessments and method statements. Primarily, it does a couple of extra things, but our bread and butter is risk assessments. So yeah, we took that over at some point last year, just because I think kind of tech is a very big part of the future of what we can do in safety. So it was a nice opportunity to kind of take that over. And now all three just kind of fill my diary and we run through them as best we can.
Good stuff. Thanks, James. And I'm pleased to say I don't know if there's any snooker fans, but we're joined by John Higgins. I suspect it isn't the John Higgins that's been playing snooker in Saudi Arabia, but it's his namesake. But I just spotted that and it made me smile because snooker is one of my pastimes, as you know. So give us the background then, James, to the booklet and the model. What led you to work on this, put it together, and publish it?
Pretty much everything is come from rebranding safety. So When I started rebranding safety, like I said, it was mostly just therapy for me for probably about the first 6 to 8 months. And then some weirdo called Christian Harris messaged me and said, "Hey, would you have guests on?" And we're like, "Oh, maybe,
Yeah,
yeah."
it's
And
all
he
my it's
said,
all my
"Yeah,
fault. It's all my fault.
yeah, it is. It is literally your fault." And you were the first guest that we had on, and then after that, we ended up just having a lot of guests on. And I, at that point, thought I had the monopoly on this new way of thinking about safety. Turns out, unfortunately, there was a lot of people that were thinking like that. So, unfortunately, I thought I was going to be really rich and wealthy because I was the only person that had this great way of thinking. Turns out, not so much, which is a good thing because I wasn't on my own. So we started interviewing like big thinkers like Todd Conklin, for example, Andrew Sharman, Carsten Bush, and then just also loads of like people just doing safety and also people not doing safety. So we also had like premiership winning, championship winning rugby players. So I'm a big rugby fan. So after I kind of stopped fanboying, we actually had a good conversation around culture and stuff like that. So we had all of these people on rebranding safety, and then what I was doing was essentially learning different ways to approach different problems, and I would go to my work and just, if I'm honest, just mess around with it and see what worked, and something's worked. And then I also was obviously a big advocate of all of this new safety stuff that was coming out, which I know is kind of a controversial kind of debate most of the time, but ultimately I was really kind of attracted by all of this safety differently, new view, and all of that stuff. But I kind of really struggled to work out how to do any of it. Like I kind of got the theory, but like was struggling to do it. So part of that was also trying all of that stuff out. Fast forward many years, about we kind of thought we could we kind of worked out the way that we approach it, the way that we think about this stuff. So we thought if we can kind of build this into a framework, it would help us. But then also if we could build it into a framework and give it to everyone else as available as we can do, then we could hopefully help as many other people. So the framework essentially is how to kind of start thinking about more broader ways of approaching safety, risk management, and so on. And that's kind of what brought the framework about. The guidebook is one of hopefully many. So I kind of didn't want to write a book. I wanted to write. I'm a bit of a geek at heart, so kind of wanted to do like comics originally, like graphic novels. I thought that'd be really cool if we did like a graphic guidebook or something. But then I started asking artists, and they would have cost me way too much money. So we just kind of worked it out ourselves, and this was kind of the halfway house, if that makes sense. So it's the aim is to do like a series of them. So this is number one, and then there's some other stuff that will be coming out at some point this year, and then also for the following years to come. And the aim is to help people just hopefully they can go and do it themselves. If they can't do it themselves, then obviously our businesses can help them out.
Yeah, perfect. And I've pulled up the page. Like we're not going to run through this whole thing today because it's there's quite a lot to it, but that is what the model kind
Yeah.
of looks like. And at the center of the model, there are these kind of four key foundational pillars, aren't there? So I thought it would probably make sense for us to kind of introduce those and talk a
Yep.
bit around those points. And then, as always, guys, everybody that's joining us, fire in with a question. So if you're on Zoom, go to reactions, raise your hand, and we'll call you up and you can ask James a question. If you're watching this somewhere else, then just type it into the comments, and I will do my very best to monitor those. I can't necessarily guarantee I'll see those as promptly as if you're on the Zoom. Zoom is the best way to join us on this, but we will do our best. So let's start with reliability. That's one of the four foundations. Or do you want to give us the four first, James, and then let's go into reliability?
Yep. So kind of going through the framework, the one thing I would say before we get into the framework is the aim of the framework is not to be a whole new way of kind of a new model to stick to. Essentially, what I don't want is people going, "Are you behavior-based safety differently, or are you risk fluent?" Whatever, like it's not a new model for you to kind of like religiously commit yourselves to. It's a framework to try and help you navigate those kind of safety differently, new view behavior based safety, and solve the problems that people are trying to solve with those things, if that makes sense. So that's why we have those kind of four foundational areas, is because when we've gone to customers, either now as a consultant, but previously in my employed roles, we tend to be able to kind of roughly put kind of problems in these little boxes. And it's not to put them in a box to say that is rigidly where they stay, but ultimately it's more just to help you navigate it in your brain, because sometimes it's a bit I can't see the wood for the trees, if that makes sense. So that's the framework is trying to help you think about approaching a problem. So is to start off with reliability is one of the more technical parts of what we would call the framework. So reliability is essentially about two things: risk management and resilience. So risk management being able to kind of foresee and deal with kind of hazards and risks and so on, and that's kind of what safety is been historically quite good at, in my opinion. I think some of the stuff we do in safety is the way that we manage risks, the way that we approach risk assessments, for example, I actually think are really good in most cases. Got its areas that we could improve on, I think, but ultimately very good. So we're kind of trying to take the science around high reliability, around resilience, around risk management, and bring that into the framework. And then we have resilience, which is the ability, obviously, to deal with change and failure, but still kind of continue on successfully as a business. So they're the two aspects essentially of that. The third part of that would be kind of our mindset and our risk-based thinking. So reliability is about essentially a business being able to designing reliability, whereas we've kind of find that most people are reliable mostly, not mostly, but kind of with a large portion of luck, so to speak. So reliability is about designing in a portion of reliability into the business.
And the point about risk-based thinking, particularly, was interesting to me because
Yeah.
I call my podcast "Safety and Risk Success" because I kind of want to bring these two aspects together. Um,
Mm.
and you've called this a framework for operational risk success, not safety success. So I've been interested to know kind of why you framed it that way, and
Mm.
from the perspective of risk-based thinking, kind of how would you sort of define that, and how is that different to perhaps a more traditional safety thinking mindset?
Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah. So essentially, why we call it operational risk is because I genuinely believe that the core aspect of what we do in health and safety, which is my kind of background, is good risk management. That is what we're identifying hazards, identifying interactions with said hazard, and then managing that interaction. That's kind of the way we would talk about risk management at Risk Fluent. That's what we do. If we kind of had a technical aspect of a hazard in safety would be like asbestos. If we were to take out the bit of asbestos and then replace that with data, there's still a hazard to the business. It's still something that's potentially going to cause disruption to the business. So we would approach it the same. It's just a hazard, right? So it's kind of like what we're trying to do is declutter our mindset and our approaches and our management systems within work, and just replacing it with one consistent approach to risk management by just saying that, look, hazard is just something that's potential to cause disruption or harm or damage or loss or anything like that. Whereas essentially that's the same as for a phishing email as it is for drilling into a wall with asbestos. So it's about having one core approach to your operations and designing in success within your operations. So that's why we call it operational success.
Okay, and what about the sort of how would you define the risk-based thinking versus more of a most people on this call are going to be health and safety professionals, what sort of shift in mindset is there involved in risk-centered approach versus a safety-centered approach?
Yeah, cool. Well, not really much different. Actually, I think most safety professionals have probably recognized most things that we talk about when we talk about risk-based thinking. One of my favorite models is actually Rasmussen's dynamic safety model, which we talk about a hell of a lot in our risk management work, which I think it might still be in the NEBOSH. I don't know, but it used to be in the NEBOSH when I did it a very long time ago. But if people don't know what that is, it's kind of like the weird diamond triangle looking model that helps you explore kind of the different types of failure and buffers and all of that stuff. And it's a really nice model. We use that. And you would probably call that a safety model. I mean, it's called the dynamic safety model, for God's sake. So it pretty much is a safety model. So we would talk about the different types of failure there. So we can't just talk about kind of safety failures. We have to be considerate of kind of in that model, you've got economical, resource, and performance is kind of what they talk about in that model. So we would say, like, we would use that model to say, look, the person in the middle, the dot in the middle of that triangle, is trying to make a decision, and they're actually trying to navigate all three of those failures at one point. So to just focus on one doesn't really give much empathy to that person who's trying to navigate all three. It's just one example. We talk about the flow of risk. So we talk about typically in safety, but not just safety. We do it a lot in quality as well. We talk about it we manage all the safety and talk about all the safety before we start the job. So we tend to do a lot of our risk assessment, our safe starts, and all of this stuff. We do all of that. We've done safety, and then crack on. We can do the job now. So it kind of like safety is out of the way, whereas actually the risk kind of flows with the aspect of time. In that some parts of a job are higher risk, and it's not always necessarily the start. So actually, the start might be quite low risk and quite easy, but actually halfway through there's a more high risk. So we talk about it in the sense of flow. And then probably the last thing we talk about mostly within that is likelihood and severity, which is very common within health and safety. But we kind of talk about severity kind of at some point taking the lead over likelihood. So when something is really going to start to alter someone's life or even unfortunately lose someone's life, then at that point likelihood needs to start kind of losing its weight. So that's when we talk about the likelihood versus severity piece. So essentially a lot of what we talk about in risk-based thinking is really pretty much from health and safety, but we're just trying to apply that more broadly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does make sense, and I really like that. I'm a fan of safety professionals kind of thinking more about risk and using the word risk because I think that often can resonate more with boards and management teams as a word, shall we say? Because there's a lot of platitudes around safety, as you well know, because you asked me about it once at a trade show. Um, Whereas I think risk is something that it just sort of sharpens the mind a bit more. Do you anything to that? Do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think half of probably more than half, I mean, 90% of what we're actually trying to do is sell a concept within a business. Like even if you're internal safety manager or whatever, you're trying to say to people, hey, come and listen to us and do what we say kind of thing. And a big part of that is selling and kind of our branding and our marketing. And unfortunately, safety or health and safety has a preconceived kind of brand. So a part of what we're doing is saying actually if you can think about safety like this, you can think about everything like this. And the way the narrative that we're talking about is trying to design a successful operation, as opposed to just talking about health and safety, if that makes sense. And there are times, obviously, a lot of the time we're a safety consultant where we do just talk about health and safety. But ultimately, it's all contributed to the success of the operations, which businesses tend to, not all the time, but tend to kind of buy into that a little bit more. So yeah, definitely is a brand consideration there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely, good stuff. So the second of the four kind of pillars, I suppose, if that's the right term, is culture.
Mhm.
Um, so that's a topic that obviously stirs up some interesting and heated discussions sometimes in our world of safety. I suppose the starting point of this would be: are we talking about culture or are we talking about safety culture, and why? And then let's start to unpack a bit more about this after that.
Yeah. Are you talking about safety culture or culture? Kind of depends on what your problem is that you're facing. Essentially, a culture is when we talk about a culture is just how people feel, and then the story and all of that stuff that surround the thing that you're talking about. So if we're talking about the business, then it would be the culture of the business. If we were talking about safety, then it probably is the culture of safety. Um, Personally, on that, I think if we spent less time bickering about the debates about the descriptions of something and whether it's a safety culture or a business culture or a bloody quality culture or a finance culture, we probably might actually have got a little bit further than where we are now. But for me, it's just the framework puts culture in there just to try and simplify it a little bit. and then to try and guide some thinking. And then we kind of try and break that down a little bit more into like leadership, kind of what we call cultural foundations, which is the use of like purpose and values and principles, which we know from like Simon Sinek's work and some other amazing people around that, the power of stuff like that. But then we would kind of draw that down even further and saying, how many times do you do just like a normal project and define what the purpose of that project is? Like sometimes I'll build a house, that's what we're trying to do. But like build a house and what? Like what does that house look like? What's the quality of that house? What's the experience as we're going through that? Kind of like you would do in sales, you would go through the customer journey, like kind of thinking about the purpose of it is to have XYZ employee journey, but also build a house, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. The leadership piece, to what extent is this framework going to help us as safety professionals to improve kind of our leadership, or is it more about trying to influence the broader leadership of the organizations that we're a part of?
Again, I mean, that's a good question, Christian. I mean, I feel like I'm giving you the same answer for everything, which might be really boring for a webinar. Um, but essentially it kind of depends on the problem that you're facing. So that again, the point of the framework is to help guide your thinking. So if you are talking about how the safety team are leading within the business, then we would be talking about safety leadership. If we're talking about the leadership is in the SLT within the business, then we would be talking about those. But essentially the principles kind of are the same. But how we do break it down in the framework is we would pick out a difference between what we call strategic leadership, which is people that are trying to steer the bigger ship of the business, if that makes sense. So like the SLT, and I probably would put the safety team in there, and that's probably where we are talking about safety leadership, senior leadership. But then we also talk about operational leadership. So we talk about people that are not necessarily in a leadership role. They're more on the shop floor. They're the people that have influence on the shop floor. They're the people that have sway. That you know, those kind of natural leaders on the shop floor. Sometimes, if I'm honest, can be seen as a bit of a pain in the ass because they're normally quite vocal. And then depending on your relationship with them, you might see them as a really helpful, necessary part of success in the workplace. And it's about appreciating those roles, those leadership people, those leaders on the shop floor, just as much as the people that have leadership in their title, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that. There's a few questions coming through on the chat, which we'll start diving into. If you do want to uh, unmute, put your hand, go to reactions, raise your hand, and we can bring you up as well. Just coming into the piece around purpose. How big a role have you seen that play in the success of managing this operational risk? In other words, if the organization has got a clearly defined purpose that people buy into, to what extent does that make life much easier to deliver on the outcomes that the framework's trying to support with?
I think so. Interestingly, when I first kind of started working with this, I'd struggled to find any business that had a really strong purpose within their organization that was tangible and actually worked through to the shop floor. Um, and I would probably only be able to answer that question back then based on what the academics say and the thought leaders say, which they all say it's really important. And there is some amazing surveys, some amazing academia out there that does show a lot of tangible evidence that kind of Daniel H. Pink's work around motivation is really, really interesting. So when you really start to look at beyond the kind of pay and incentivization of a role, and Daniel starts to look at actually people just getting enjoyment and purpose and belonging out of something is really, really powerful and interesting. So there's definitely a really kind of important power to purpose. However, in the last like year, we have taken on a customer that we've gone to that's I should try and navigate this without kind of talking about the or giving it away who they are.
Yeah, not
Uh,
be too specific. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So trying to navigate that, but ultimately they have a actually really strong purpose, and it's really clear. And then they also have really strong and clear values. And as the business has grown and taken on other aspects where they've kind of essentially taken on new businesses that have their existing like mini culture and trying to bring them into their culture, we've actually taken a lot of what they do and brought it and learned from it ourselves and brought it into our work. And it was really quite interesting to see. We haven't done that. They've done that themselves. We're there actually helping them more with technical work. They've done that themselves, and they've got like a framework the same as we have. They've got like, they call it their culture burger. So they've got their culture burger that is just consistent throughout the organization. The purpose is clear, the values is clear, their behaviors and their decisions all structured around this kind of burger, so to speak. And it just works. And it's so interesting to see the power of it run throughout this entire organization. It really does structure all of the conversations they have. And it's everyone just talked about the purpose of this organization. And it was
Hmm.
really quite nice to just kind of go in there and not have to convince someone that this stuff actually works because they've kind of worked it out themselves. So it was quite easy for us in a way, in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting that, isn't it? Because like you, it's something that I believe to be true, but finding the evidence of it is harder to do. And
Yeah.
I think it just supports this piece around leadership and selling that you were talking about before, because actually being safe is a great purpose. I'm not saying that is going to be the purpose, but it's actually a cause that we can all rally behind, and it's something that can unite us all and actually get us to act on a set of values and put in place certain behaviors, and do things in a certain way that should be a positive for the business. So yeah, I was very interested to hear you unpack that one. Let's move on then to human performance. So is that the
Yeah.
same as HOP, human organization performance, or is it something different?
No, no. Again, there's not really anything new in this framework. It's about trying to help people kind of navigate it to really kind of try and provide some value. But ultimately, it's just trying to help people do this shit. If that makes sense. So, human performance, when I talk about it, is no different from HOP. HOP is just a brand or a model that's very kind of proven, in my opinion. Also, that's kind of what my educational route was. So that's what I call it. If I'm honest, if we wanted to get in the debate between behavioral based safety and human performance, in my opinion, they're exactly the same. There are little slightly tweaks, little slight tweaks in how we talk about things and how we would say maybe approach a problem. I don't know, but there are slight differences. But the core founding kind of purpose, so to speak, or their core philosophies was probably the best way to say it. I think is the same. So what nothing different. It's just again trying to simplify it without oversimplification to help people kind of approach it. So we kind of talk about influencing behavior. So simply put, just how are you influencing behavior within the business. So go and look into that. Go and have a look at the structures you have in place on what is currently influencing behavior, and is that the behavior you want, and so on and so forth. Then we would talk about building kind of people-centered workplaces. So, and again, coming back to bog standard safety, I think the Health and Safety at Work Act and what we've done in safety or what we've tried to do in safety for a long time, including people and risk assessments and designing that around how they experience work, is that's the bog standard health and safety, or it should be. Um, and sorry, I'm just getting distracted by the questions. So we should probably come to some of the questions in a minute, Chris.
Yeah, we will. We will.
Question.
Don't worry, we will.
So yeah, talking about all of that stuff around, are we getting all frustrated because people are not following safety or not following the rules or whatever? But ultimately, have we actually considered those people in that process when we created that rule, so to speak? Um, so that's what we were talking about in that kind of people-centered approach. The kind of this real simple example would be Norman Door. There's a really good video that Vice did, which is dead simple, and it kind of communicates it through the concept of a Norman Door, which is just a great simple concept for everyone to get. And then lastly, we kind of talk about competence, which sounds bog standard, but we kind of add a couple of extra things in competence, where we tend to talk about competence from the point view of tasks, and we would talk about task competence, but we tend to kind of forget this kind of social competence where a lot of people talk about soft skills. So it's that basically, but then also kind of risk competence. So how are people, how are we helping the business kind of, or the people in the business, sorry, how are we helping them kind of think about how we're making those risk-based decisions, how we are kind of approaching those situations and so on. So it's literally just a guide to kind of say, think about this and then think about that, and then think about this and then think about that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does definitely. So let's clear off the fourth foundation, which is organizational learning, and then let's delve into the questions. And I've got some more questions
Yeah.
and comments and stuff as well. So there's plenty going on in the chat. So that's good. So organizational learning. What do you mean by that? How do you define that? Why is it important? And if people don't have that as a sort of key foundation or pillar of this
Yeah.
model, what could sort of go wrong?
So organizational learning really is again just giving you a guidance to be able to think about where you are learning. So how are you getting all these data sources back? So we're saying be people centered, but how are you learning all of that stuff? If that makes sense. So how are you getting the data that tells you how to tweak and how to kind of adjust where you need to? So typically in safety, one of the things that we don't do very well is learn from anything other than just stuff going wrong. So in safety, we tend to learn when things go wrong. And I think we're probably one of the best at that. But ultimately, there are many other things that are going on in the world which we could learn from before something goes wrong. So we talk about learning from success, and we talk about just learning from normal work, which is really common and popular kind of phraseology within human organizational performance. And then we also talk about learning from, I think I said learning from success, but we would kind of say not enough of us in business world, but particularly in safety, kind of do learn from the fact that we've done this amazing project, but why did we do this amazing project so well and without kind of hurting someone or killing someone, for example? Like, why are we as good as what we say we are? So we would go, hey, we've had no accidents for the last 5 years. Okay, great. Why have we had no accidents? Without just going, because we've got risk assessments, like, but actually going, why are those risk assessments working then, and really stress testing things, if that makes sense
And is
within
it just luck as
organizations.
well?
Yeah, exactly. So we use that phraseology quite a lot, like design versus luck and so on. Uh, we would also talk about this is probably the main section where we start to talk about workers done versus workers imagined. So managing that organizational drift and understanding how big the gap is between the two. Is there a gap? And so on. So having some kind of fingers on the pulse of the business to see what reality is versus what safety is. And there's a lot of really amazing work there around kind of what David Provan and Drew Ray did in their paper around safety clutter, and a lot of stuff what they did was really good. We talk about that a lot in our work. And then finally, we talk about a lot of psychological safety within there. So, like talking about whether people are motivated to speak up. Most of the time, we talk about whether people are feeling safe to speak up. My experience, particularly in the UK, most people feel very comfortable to tell you what they think about the business that they work in. What they often don't feel comfortable with it, or what they don't have, is motivation to speak up most of the time. So if you go and ask them what do you think of the business, 9 times out of 10 they'll tell you, but they're just not motivated to come and tell you because they've told you before and no one's listening, kind of thing. So we talk about psychological safety within there. I don't, again, I will caveat that by saying I don't think that's anything new. I think Amy's work is really clear on motivation. I think the work to Amy is also really clear on motivation and also trust with the organization in there as well. I just think some of the narrative that come off the back of that, we seem to have missed those points. So that's why we kind of put it in the framework, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's all good. So we've covered the four key pillars. Um, where would you say people are, I say people, I mean organizations are typically strongest, and where would you say people are or organizations are typically sort of weakest across those four areas? And I understand that the four break down into other sub categories as well.
Good question. It does vary. I find some businesses are like so good and with like their cultural relationships within the organization. Leadership is really good, and so on. And then you go to other, but they're really crap at technical. And then you go to other businesses, and they're just like really good at kind of technical risk management, but not so good at other. It does massively vary. I think we are really, really good at building, particularly within safety, we're really, really good at building good, strong, structural kind of systems within an organization, like scaffolding for the business, so to speak. I think we're phenomenal at that. I think badges and accreditations, I give them a bad rep a lot of the time. They get a bit of a bad rep in this book, and in some of Carson Bush's work, they get a bit of a bad rep as well. But they are valuable to the business, right? So we're phenomenal at that stuff as well. Demonstrating safety, I would call as a risk. So people being able to demonstrate safety to external stakeholders. We're phenomenally good at that. We're really, really good at that. But as for like technical details, whether it's like most people are really good at reliability, but some people are really good. No one's very good at human performance. It kind of doesn't work like that. A lot of people, they vary. There's huge variation, but typically I'd say in the UK, which is where we do most of our work, we do work outside the UK a little bit, but most of our work is in the UK. I'd probably say one of our biggest areas, potential areas for growth, would probably be our approach to the people of the shop on the shop floor, but also the approach from the shop, the relationship from the shop floor upwards. So like we have this movement within kind of, I'd say like maybe safety differently, but like I don't not just Sydney's work. If I was going to collectively bring them all into one, if that makes sense, like new view safety, there's a huge move between like to push us to listen to the shop floor, which I think 100% we need to. That's so important. And then the deference to expertise is like a really, well, we quite enjoy that, use that phraseology quite a lot. The desperate deference to expertise being defer to the expert in the room. And when we talk about work, we are talking about the shop floor. The shop floor is the expert of work. What we seem to have done is applied this real like empathetic, like deference to expertise approach to the shop floor, but we seem to have very little empathy for these business leaders that are also humans. So we kind of approach leaders and these big organizations with this real kind of approach of lack of empathy, lack of flexibility, and the relationship between the two is kind of frayed. I'd say we find that quite consistent. Is how we approach the shop floor from how we approach the top floor, so to speak, and vice versa. There's just a breakdown in relationship between the two.
Mm. It's really interesting that, isn't it? Because people are people at the end of the day. And I
Mm,
always say to people if I'm advising them on, whether it's safety or growing their business or whatever, they're asking me about how could I do this better? I tend to say, find what's in it for them. So whoever it is you've got
mm,
to convince
yeah.
and to influence, what's in it for them and try and understand them with that radical empathy. And I think sometimes we sort of perceive that, if they're the managing director or the COO or whatever, they must have been there, done it, and know exactly what they're doing and not have any problems and be totally in control. And that just isn't the case, is it?
No, no, and they're just these like two. We kind of when I talk about it, I tend to talk about like use the analogy of a tree. So like the bush at the top of the tree is kind of like the SLT, the directors, board of directors, right? And they can't see the roots, and the roots is the shop floor. They can't see it because all the mud in the way, right? And then the roots can't see the bush either. So they've got no connection other than the trunk, but the trunk is a lot smaller than everything else. So we've got this like bottleneck of information that kind of comes in, filters everything out, and then spreads out at the bottom and vice versa. So we kind of talk about it like that, but they've all got these different perceptions of each other, which most are kind of wrong. Like the shop floor seem to think that if, at the instant you're a director, you're kind of minted, and then the directors seem to think that because you're on the shop floor, if you're kind of raising issues, you're just a pain in the ass kind of thing. And there's just kind of this breakdown in relationship, and we see this exist in tiny businesses all the way up to big businesses. There is just
Mm.
this weird breakdown halfway through that kind of tree trunk, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and the tree trunk is analogous to a conversation or a relationship. And if you haven't got that relationship and you're not open enough and willing to have a difficult conversation with but bearing in mind that just because you're having a difficult conversation doesn't mean that that's going to spoil the relationship.
Mm,
Arguably, not having that difficult conversation is what will spoil the relationship in the long run, because if you don't have those
mm,
sort of more difficult conversations, you kind of breed resentment. And then,
yeah.
if you have resentment for somebody, which is kind of what you were saying there, there's a little bit of envious resentment, shall we say, going up. But I'm just sort of stereotyping, and there's
Yeah,
the kind
yeah.
of resentment going down, and that's because there's a lack of communication.
Yeah. And do you know what? It's been really interesting, like as running a business myself over the last couple of years, like we're still relatively young from business director point of view, so to speak. We've had to try and apply principles to ourselves and really realize how challenging a lot of this stuff is. And when we've had situations where we needed to have like an awkward conversation, I think one thing we have done really well within the whole team is all of us have jumped on it as quick as possible and just had the conversation.
Yeah.
And we kind of gone in with an approach of like what is the problem and how can we kind of solve that problem. I think a lot of the time we tend to go into this conversation of we tend to go into every conversation, and we say that we don't, but most of us do as a kind of human race, into going into every conversation looking for who's at fault. So we'd be like, oh, the senior managers are at fault because they made this decision. Oh no, it's the middle managers at fault because they filtered out all the important shit, or it's a shop floor at fault because they didn't listen. We do it in safety as well. Like, oh, BBS is shit and safety differently is better, and vice versa. And we just argue,
Mm,
and we're always looking for one that's better than the other instead of just trying to find something that works for you in that moment. Might not be the thing that works for you in the next moment, but it works right now. To just have those kind of conversations, but more importantly, the conversation should be framed around the narrative of let's try and find a solution. So we try and find out what's going on, what don't you like that's happening, and then what do you want? That kind of what does kind of success look like, even though that's a bit of a cliche nowadays, but that narrative of how we go into, and again coming back to models like we spoke about earlier, I always wonder if I pronounce it wrong, but Batari's box is really old classic model, but like my attitude affects my behavior, and then my behavior affects your attitude. Yeah, your attitude affects your behavior, then your behavior affects my attitude. So, for example, if I come into this with a really shitty attitude, it would affect everyone else in this call. And so, for example, if anyone else comes into this call with a really crappy attitude or a negative attitude, it will affect somebody else's behavior within here. So that kind of narrative of going into it is so important, but I don't think we appreciate how important it actually is.
mm, mm. Yeah, I'm guilty of not being very good at having those difficult conversations. It's something I'm like working on and trying to be better at. But so I can really see that there's a huge benefit to just recognizing that. And also, I
And
think
that's
the
also
beauty of
oh, sorry,
God,
Christian, carry on. I'm sorry,
no,
I
God,
was just going to say that when you said earlier about purpose and values and principles, like that's the value of that stuff. It's
mm,
so much easier to have a difficult conversation if you know that we're all in it for the same purpose. We're all trying to get the widgets out of the door. Then, in a way, the awkward conversation becomes easier because you know you're guided by the frameworks of the business,
mm.
so to speak, and the frameworks of yourself.
Yeah, and it's the same in personal relationships as well, isn't it? If it's your friend or your partner or whatever, your family member, then there are going to be these things which are much more important, most likely, than this particular thorny issue you need to deal with, that are kind of binding you together and should
Yeah,
give you that kind of ability to have that sort of challenging
yeah,
discussion and kind of go from there. Um,
yeah.
so there's lots and lots of questions in the chat. I'm struggling to get through them all. If anybody wants to actually kind of come and have a chat with James and I, then go to reactions, raise your hand, and unmute. But I'll start working my way through some of the questions. But before we do that, um, I asked you the question about where do people typically do better and not so well, or where they've got room for improvement for a reason, because I'm the master of the segue. Tell us about the scorecard and how people can go away and assess kind of how they're currently getting on based on the framework?
Yeah, and then I'm just looking. I'll picked out a couple of questions.
Okay,
I'll
cool.
answer. I'll go through a couple of Clays as well.
Plays on
So
fire in the chat.
yeah, yeah, clearly. Hello. So the scorecard, yeah, good question. We got two scorecards on the website. The scorecard is for the operational success scorecard. It is based around the framework. So the aim of that again is to try and help people just pick out some areas to kind of focus and get started. All of this stuff is just about trying to help people see the wood for the trees. So is there kind of a marketing and kind of lead generation aspect to it? Of course there is. Like we're trying to run a business, right? But ultimately what we're also trying to do is give enough to help people. So book, if you want it in hard copy, you can get it off the website. But ultimately, you do the scorecard, you get the framework on a PDF free of charge. So you kind of get a little bit of a guide as to where your problems might be, and then the framework should help you kind of try and approach that thinking. So that's what the scorecard is for. Um, so I
Perfect.
think one of Clay's first questions was, "Do I know what's wrong with safety?" I think was one of them.
Yeah,
Um,
so I think he was sort of saying that we need to be a bit more introspective and sort of see ourselves as the safety profession as being a key part of the problem rather than building what you were just saying about blame, I suppose.
yeah,
So yeah,
and the with the conversation not providing any real value either. So thanks for that, Clay. Appreciate that, mate. But let's see if I can have a look at your kind of core problem with safety. I think if no would be the answer. I don't because I don't know if there is a core problem with safety. I think everyone has different problems with safety. Some people are really fucking good at safety, if I'm honest, but they're not good at other things. And I would say it massively varies with each one. And part of my kind of frustration, which led to the framework, which of what we've kind of done is, and we actually I think is still in the intro for rebrand. We might have changed the intro for rebrand safety, but it was in the intro for rebrand safety for a very long time. Went on a little rant that said everyone was looking for one solution to a problem, but there isn't behavioral based safety is right because we're all looking for one thing. So we're all looking for what one problem and one solution, kind of thing. So that was. Oh, it just said my connection's unstable. Have you still got me, Christian? Am I
yeah,
still
I've still
here?
got you, James. You cut out a
Oh,
couple of times, but it's fine. Yeah, yeah.
oh, sorry. I'm on shared Wi-Fi, so it might
Cool.
drop out. But yeah, essentially, my answer, Clay, if I'm honest, would be I don't know if there is a core problem. I would say we all have many different problems, and actually, if you just accept that there's probably more than one problem, and there's also probably more than one solution, then maybe we would start kind of moving forward, so to speak.
Yeah. Jonathan's put a sort of follow-up question to this in the chat, which is, do we think that the health and safety profession is guilty of overcomplicating and adding unnecessary complexity to our management systems, and that's what's disengaging people? What's your view on that, James?
I I've been unpopular in the past for saying that I don't think the safety profession is as accountable for kind of the lack of improvement over the last kind of decade or more. Um, but what I would probably say to that is that there's context to everything, right? So if we were to say, oh, safety overcomplicate things, there's probably a reason as to why we're overcomplicating things. And I actually think that the HSE did a really good paper. It was during the kind of Tory red tape campaign where they were trying to blame safety for all of the red tape stuff, and the HSE did a really good paper on the legislation to see if the legislation kind of drove UK health and safety to have all of these crazy paperworks and stuff. And they were kind of, well, not really. Actually, it's more like stakeholder relationships and insurance and all of this stuff that actually drive all of this requirement for paperwork. So we could sit here and say, oh, the safety profession need to be kind of accountable for stuff. I think Yeah, we do, but I wouldn't say accountability is blame. I would say accountability would be us saying, "Hey, we're just trying to find a new way to do something now because we think that that other way of doing this particular thing is not working anymore." That's accountability for me. That's not like saying the safety profession are horrendously shit and need to like completely change what they do and all of this stuff. That's not accountability, that's blame. So for me, accountability is what we're doing currently, which the safety professional is doing really, the profession is doing really well, which is being quite self-critical and self-reflective of ourselves and having debates and kind of reading about stuff, which I think we do quite well. We could probably stop debating as much and start doing. That would probably be better. But
Mm.
ultimately, I think we are accountable, but I think we're holding ourselves to account, which is a good thing. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that would be my kind of stance on
Well,
it.
well, Jonathan's put his hand up, so why don't you come unmute Jonathan? See, tell us the answer
Yeah,
if
please
James has
do.
answered the question.
Thanks. No, it's not a comment of drive and blame, but my experiences are that in this profession, we overcomplicate things and add complexity. And I'm not saying there is one thing that drives that. You've
Yeah,
got, you've got your customers, you've got ISO standards, you've got so many cogs that ultimately create this complexity.
yeah,
And what we tend to find is sometimes it's knee-jerk reaction of putting in a policy,
yeah,
doing a
yeah,
risk assessment unnecessarily, and we're very reactive to the environment, and we are all put under different pressures. And I think lots of things is pressure driven to add this complexity. But also, I think some complexity is added to the management systems from the health and safety profession because of sometimes it's a lack of understanding the actual risk that we're dealing with. And it's
Okay.
going belts and braces. And the issue with that is when we're adding complexity to our systems, um, with anything, when you add complexity, there's more chances of things falling over. And the more complexity we add, we're making it more difficult for the operators to actually do the task. So as a result of the operators finding the task more complicated because the whole management system's been overcomplicated, where we find is that people actually then take shortcuts. So what I'm trying to say is that in the profession ourselves, we all have to look inwards. I'm a health and safety professional like everyone else here, I imagine, is looking at ourselves and thinking, okay, do we really, really need to do this? And what is the outcome of us doing this? And are we running the risk of, as I said in the comments, disengaging people, but causing people to take shortcuts because of how we've managed the system? And as I
Yeah.
said before, it's various things that cause us to do these things. It's not one thing,
yeah,
but there's lots of stress, complexity, different requirements from different stakeholders, and it's actually a profession standing up and saying, actually, by us going down this line, we are making things more challenging than they really need to be. So it's the health and safety professional to stand up and say, no, we shouldn't be doing this. This is the line that we should be going down.
yeah, yeah,
It's a
mate.
it's a difficult balance though, isn't it? As well, I think, because if you look in my area, for example, of trying to prevent people from slipping over, I would say we're almost too far the other way. We're not quite thorough enough. So we need to be a little bit more complex, and that's why it's still proving to be such a thorny issue that we're not able to solve. So it's all about the balance, isn't it?
Yeah, I
Yeah, I
think
think
you're
I've got
absolutely right, Vic.
potentially like. Oh, sorry, Jonathan.
Sorry, James.
Go
No, no,
on.
no. What I was going to say is that comes back to the same point that we all tend to oversee or forget about is it's being reasonable and proportionate. That is what the
Mm.
legislation says. That is what we do as professions is what we should be doing is reasonable proportionate to the level of risk. And you're absolutely right. Just in terms of sometimes you can see it's the sublime to the ridiculous. Um, and it's trying to get that middle ground. And it is challenging.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. I think as well, like I find a lot of the time the safety profession could do a better job of helping the safety profession, if that makes sense. Like a lot of the time we are in like if you think about construction, for example, it's a very kind of us and them relationship. So like if we're looking after our customer, we're the safety profession for that professional for that business, and then we're kind of sending stuff to their customer, which it has a safety team. And the relationship is automatically before we go into it, like really us versus them. So it would take, I think, quite a brave safety professional of a smaller business to say, no, we don't need that actually, and we're not going to implement it. But what we tend to find is, because we've had those conversations, Jonathan, where we've said to the customer, you don't need that. That's absolutely stupid. Like, you're adding layers of paperwork that you don't need, you're adding complexity, blah, blah, blah. But essentially the response we get back is, this customer says we have to have it, and it's a £6 million contract, and if we don't have it, we're going to lose this contract. And then you've got all of these weird complex, which I think you've touched on, Jonathan, that we live in this weird world of all these different pressures. And I think just having a conversation around someone's health and their safety is pressure enough. And then we've got all of these kind of commercial, economical pressures as well. But I think you're right. I think I've done it myself. One of my first safety jobs, we had an incident, and then my response was to implement a paperwork kind of checklist. And then about 2 years later, we kind of had discovered kind of decluttering and all of this stuff. Kind of went back in and ended up removing that paperwork that just stood there collecting dust. And I think we'd done one of the forms because it wasn't solving the problem, but it was making me feel a little bit better because I'd implemented something. But what I hadn't done is implemented something that actually worked, if that makes sense. So I think we do have a bit of knee-jerk reaction and implement stuff. I think Grenfell is a good example of that as well. Like, Dame Judith Hackett came out the back of Grenfell and said one of the biggest problems in construction is the complexity around building a compliant building. And what we've done as a kind of nation is implement two more pieces of legislation and a new enforcing body. For me, that's just more complexity. So yeah, I think you're touching on a really good, important point, Jonathan.
Good stuff. Craig, you've had your hand up for a while, so do you want to unmute and jump on board and give us a question or some thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I think the thing is that you're all talking and please take this not being sarcastic, a health and safety professional, environmental and quality of 20 plus years. But I think you said it before, there is no one fit that fits all. And that's where some of the complexity comes in. The problem that you've got, and I've done cultural behavior, habits, and teaching training, etc. The problem that we've got as professionals and as a business community, like I said before, there's a lot of complexity because a lot of other models, a lot of other strategies come into health and safety, and that creates a lot of grey areas. And you were saying about responsibility, your responsibility. You're also talking accountability and liability. They're main issues that any business or any client, as a consultant of many years and have worked with major players to small to mediums, the problem that we've got is you've got to go from bottom up as well as top down. And that's where a lot of people miss the golden nugget, in so much as that somebody said before, I think on one of the questions or one of the comments about Australia bringing in psychological elements. It's got to be the right type of psychological elements to know how people want to learn. And that's a case of how they learn, what they're going to learn, or what you need them to learn. But also then the key thing is do they want to do it? And all I'll say from my psychological elements as training is that there's only one person who can change that person who's looking in the mirror. And it's that person who's looking in the mirror. And that's the challenge that we've got as health and safety professionals. We can do a lot of things and we can put a lot of scorecards, and I'm not having to go at anybody's system, but it's got to be relative to that business, to the risk, to the culture, or to the strategy and want of the person from the top. But more importantly, from the person at the bottom, of how they are going to then create their own value to it, their own standard, and say, right, I'm not coming to work to get hurt. I've got the potential. What am I going to do to stop me getting hurt? Right, I'm going to follow this system. I'm going to follow that risk assessment, method statement, whatever, permit. But the thing is that if they don't see value in it and they don't think that it's being followed through from the top down then, and it's just a tick box exercise, or it's an insurance or assurance point of view, where'd you go from there? Because the thing is that it's creating those, I think I said it before, standards and values, but don't always think it's just top down. It's got to be bottom up.
I agree.
Sorry, that's my rant over. But
I think it's quite good. I think it is good. We kind of talk a lot on rebrand and safety, and within Risk Fluent about like this kind of safety as originally intended. What we're trying to achieve is safety as originally intended. If you look at the Health and Safety at Work Act, I think it's clear. It's always asked us to be reasonable and practicable and taught to the shop floor.
Yeah, but it's grey. It's very grey because when you go into a court of law, which I've been done as an expert specialist for defending somebody after they've had fatalities, the problem is that what one inspector says to another inspector, to another one judge to another judge, to another one court to another court, we've got a very, how can I put it? We've got a very intuitive system. We've got a very intuitive professionals. But going back to the gentleman before, we've got to make it complex sometimes to cover the insurance and assurance and to cover the CEO or director or the board. The thing is that, and I mean, what I usually say, and GDPR or whatever, simple, stupid is the key. We make things too complicated because of what that person is trying to do to make sure that they either cover the business. And don't get me wrong, business risk is important. I know that from a quality point of view. I've put business continuity models in place, UK and abroad. But the thing is that it's getting the right set of standards and values so that anybody and everybody can say, right, if I work for you, and like I said to you before on my statement before about induction, you set it from day one. How many people have an induction for half an hour or an hour? And it's a case of it's a tick box. There's no test at the end of it. There's no, do you understand it? It's just a case of, right, there you go, along you go.
Yeah. And it's interesting with the whole thing around again in my field, right? If something goes to court, what it tends to boil down to is the result of a slip test. But what we're told by the Health and Safety at Work Act is to take reasonably practicable steps. And then some people are saying, well, it's not reasonable or practicable to have a slip test. I would disagree with that personally, but they haven't done it. But then it all boils down to not were they doing things that were reasonably practicable in their mind, but does it pass this, yes or no, black and white? So why not be a bit more focused in certain aspects?
All I'll say is an old colleague of mine who's just retired from the HSL in Derbyshire. He's done slip testing for 20 odd years. Why can't we introduce something to that model or to that standard and go, you know what? You've been looking at it for how many years? What can we do to make sure that there's something of a set standard in place? But too many people are scared of putting the head on the chopping block, including the HSE sometimes. Sorry.
Kate says she hates slip testing. Right, that's it. You're banned, Kate. Sorry. Can't come anymore. Any thoughts on that, James, before we go over to Alex?
Without kind of running the risk of going on forever, I'm not sure I 100% agree. I agree on a lot of things that you've said, but not essentially the end outcome of like we just need to kind of set consistent standards. There are so many different businesses that do so many different things. I don't think you could set like one standard and get more specific and less complex or less grey legislation. I actually think our legislation in the UK, yes, it has flaws, 100%. I think Provan and Ray did a really good couple of podcasts, I think, on goal-based legislation versus the other one, like the more prescriptive approach I think the US take. There are pros and cons to both. But actually, I think the flexibility that we have is beautiful, and I think it's really good. And I actually think Jonathan and Terry actually have touched on one of the bigger problems here is consistency of the standard of delivery of those legislation is one of the biggest problems. So maybe instead of regulating the system, we should potentially regulate the profession and create a more consistent delivery method of stuff, as opposed to a more consistent model of regulation, if that kind of makes sense for the businesses. I think there's some legs in that. I'll be interested to see if it ever happens, because I think a certain professional body might lose too much money if you did something like that. But we'll wait and
Oh,
see.
James, I thought you were going to stick away from that for once, but you
No,
couldn't help yourself,
never.
could you? James, can I just check, how are you doing on time? I'm happy to carry on for a few more minutes. Are you okay to do that?
Yeah, I can
Or
do another 5 minutes and then I will have
yeah?
to crack on, unfortunately. But yeah,
No.
Naomi's put her hand up like 5 times, I think. I'm going to
Yeah,
put it back down.
she keeps putting her hand up and putting it down again. So Naomi, let's call you up and then we'll get to Alex as well, and then we'll wrap up. We'll go ladies first. Go on.
Hi guys. So
Hi.
this is actually a conversation extremely dear to me, and it's actually one of those big things that I want to tackle in the WHS industry in Australia. So not just and if I can get global, well, hey, I'll goals, hopes, and dreams. Um, I'm going to come in hard and fast and defend the Australian model because it has a very good balance of both. So we have what Craig was talking about with the extremely regulated, very, very black and white legislation, black and white regulations, black and white standards, and they're extremely high. And it the way we do it is great. I'm really, really proud and very, very proud to be learning in the Australian industry. That's for sure. It doesn't have the flexibility because it's not inflexible for a very good reason. But what you do find in that is exactly what you were talking about, James, is those people that come out and they're inflexible in their way of thinking. So they come out and they'll be like, what it says is this, and this. And so it's like, yes, that's what it says. But exactly what you said, how are you delivering that to the people? So I know in my business, the way I said to my people, in order to get them to sign on, to their JSAs, onto their swims, follow their hierarchy of controls and their own personal risk assessment, do their take fives. The way I do that is I have to sell that as this is your insurance. It's like you pay your insurance every month. You pay your car insurance. I said, I have no idea about anything in your job. They're electricians. We're an electrical engineering company. And I say, I have no idea about anything to do with your jobs. I said, but what I do know is my job. And I said, and I've said to them in a toolbox store, if you do this, it makes my job 5 times easier because I know that you understand the processes that are in place. Those black and white, this is a high risk, therefore we're going to do this so we can, go home safely at the end of the day. So it's very black and white, like you can't argue with it. So our laws even stipulate that the worker has responsibility to follow what we've put in place. And if they actively choose against it, they're actively choosing to not follow work health and safety laws, regulations, and stipulations. Therefore, the fault and the responsibility falls on the worker. They are responsible for their own health and safety in that regard, following what the business has put in place. So it's really great that it's black and white like that. But again, it's that delivery from the person. And I know this, and I know he's not in here, which is great. My opposing worker is very much the other side of the coin, which is he doesn't care. It's like if it's written there in black and white, well, they have to do it. It's like, well, yes, they have to do it, but how are you delivering that to get them to sign on to that job safety analysis every single day? How are you getting them to pick it up and go for another walk around to make sure that they've covered everything in it? And it's getting that buy-in from your workers. So yes, there can 100% be those black and white, this is what it is, there's nothing I can do to change it, but it's how you deliver it. So, but that's how we do it. We're like, this is law, there's nothing I can do about it. What can I do to make your journey more comfortable in getting to that, so we can both work toward that same goal kind of thing? And that's how we work in Australia. So anyway, that's my little rant. Thank you so much.
All right, sounds good. I like it.
Thanks, Naomi. Alex, you've had your hand up for a while as well. Come on, give us
Yep.
a good question to
It's
finish
a
us off.
question for Chris and James, and something that I've learned over the years by myself was that we need communication skills as health and safety managers. And James touched upon personal branding, and I would try to extend it to senior people in here who are heads of health and safety departments about department branding. So, are there any, I don't know, any tips and tricks, any recommendations that you gents have for people in here on how to better communicate with their with the directors that they're working under, with the managers that they're working at the same level, and with the people uh, in lower ranking positions, and how to brand themselves as not just the person with a clipboard in their hand, but also part of the business and part of a larger thing than just themselves. Thank you.
What a question. I've so I've got a couple of things I want to add, but before I do that, I want to give a shout out to Peter, who's part of my team, who's in the call. He has done a lot of stuff around this in the past that I love. So Peter often talks with our customers about like, do you have a communication strategy for safety? So like this is your stuff that you're trying to roll out within the business. Do you actually have a strategy in how you're communicating that stuff out to the business? Peter was the person that kind of introduced me to that many years ago when I first talked to him on a similar call to this, really. And I was like, well, bugger me. Yeah, I've never really thought that actually. Because we often kind of, and this kind of follows on from Naomi's point as well around we kind of go you have to read this risk assessment because under the section X of the Health and Safety at Work Act you have to collaborate with us, you have to work with us and cooperate, right? So we just go, you have to do it, but that's not getting their buy-in and getting them to go, yeah, I get why I have to do this. So having like communication strategies instead of just kind of doing it is always a great thing. I was just trying, as you were talking, trying to find my slides of some of our trainings so I can remember whose work it is so that I can refer them correctly. But there's some really good work around just leadership in general. And I think a lot of what we talk about in leadership is actually communication and relationship building, which Terry has touched on in the comments as well. Essentially, building relationships is always the pinnacle. You know, if you've got a good positive relationship with someone and they see you in a positive light, you're always going to have more influence in that situation. But also it's helpful then to get the information back from them. They're more forthcoming to tell you what they like and what they don't like. So then you probably have to worry less about communication because you know they're going to like it before you roll it out, if that makes sense. So that's kind of being a bit more people centered. I'm desperately scrolling through my slides to try and find it and I can't find it, but essentially a lot of work in leadership talk about how we influence people. Sometimes we influence just on hierarchy, so we just literally kind of expect people to listen to us because I'm the boss, right? Which is, it kind of works, but like it's never going to be sustainable. Then we would do it on like something which I struggle to pronounce, which is reciprocity, which is basically I'll do you a favor, you do me a favor. But actually, if we actually just start building positive relationships with people, listening to what they want, and then engaging them in the job, I always think that's better. One of my favorite kind of psychological theories would probably be the IKEA effect, which essentially, if you build a piece of furniture yourself, you like it a lot more and you put a lot more value on it. So if you take a piece of work within safety, if you want someone to buy into it a little bit more, involve them in it, make them part of that process, and they will buy into it because ultimately they built it with you. So I would kind of say comms is kind of the last bit. If we do all a bit before, or we tend to be a bit better on that stuff. But definitely the big shout out to Peter around communication strategy, but then also another communication. I'm sorry, another shout out to Peter would be he's the only safety professional I know that actually consulted with a brand specialist, a branding specialist, to help him brand a management system before he came over to us in consulting. So he actually kind of got a communication, a marketing, and branding specialist to help him design his management system, essentially all of his stuff within safety, to ensure it kind of went out in a more kind of tangible or kind of understandable way, or more kind of easy to communicate way. I'm pretty sure that's Pete. Give me a thumbs up in the comment if it was you, Pete. If it's not, then I've just given you someone else's work. Was it Pete? Yeah, it was Pete. So yeah, like there's some really good things that Peter had done, which I think is absolutely amazing. But ultimately, I think if we were a bit more people centered, we would do a much better job on that as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's definitely a key takeaway, and I'm conscious of time, so I won't delve too much into this with my own thoughts. But I'm always happy to have that conversation offline with you, Alex, and give you some further thoughts on that. Listen, James, thank you so much for today. It's been really engaging. The chat's been on fire. We may have to do another one, I think, to try and get to some more of the questions. So perhaps we can look to schedule something in the coming weeks and months ahead. Just quickly, if people want to learn a bit more and pick up on this conversation and sort of try and go away and implement some of this stuff, what's the best place for them to go to?
Yeah, sure. So for rebranding safety, you can literally just Google rebranding safety. You can go on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube. That's where most of our content in. If you've never heard of rebranding safety, there is a metric shit ton of content that you can kind of go through. I'd probably apologise for the first 12 months worth because I was just an angry young man back then. When we start getting guests on it, it gets a bit better.
Other than the first guest.
Yeah. After you, Christian, it just went up from there, mate.
It could only go in one direction after me.
Consulting wise, so the scorecard and the guidebook and the framework and all the stuff we talk about, we've got some like products and stuff in there. That would be www.riskfluentltd.com, so riskfluentlimited.com. Please add me, Peter, Sherry, or Carly on LinkedIn, and all of us will kind of talk to you and have a chat about this stuff. And then for our app is riskassessor.net. So that's our risk assessment app, riskassessor.net. And like I say, just add me on LinkedIn. I'm always up for a chat. Pete's put some LinkedIn for the Risk Fluent page in the comments as well just now. Thank you for that, Pete. But yeah, that's it.
Good stuff. Well, thanks very much, James. Really enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody, for the high levels of engagement. It's obviously a topic that's resonating. So let's carry on this discussion on LinkedIn and elsewhere. And we'll pick it up again with James, I'm sure, in the future, perhaps when part 2 of his guidebook or whatever the right terminology is comes out. In the meantime, yes, in the meantime, thanks for that. Really enjoyed it. And we will look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks on the Safety Roundtable. Cheers.
Nice one.